Hi, and welcome to another lecture on multi-agent learning. This time we're going to explain satisficing play. We already discussed this in the context of reinforcement learning, but this algorithm is important enough to discuss separately. I hope you... Well, the explanation will be not that long because it is directed towards a programming assignment. Nevertheless, I have a couple of pretty animations in store, so I hope you keep watching. Also, not to skip directly to the animation, but follow the build-up. I think I will need for the basics I need 10 minutes, and for the entire discussion of the full paper of Stimson, which discusses satisficing play, I need half an hour. So, satisficing play assumes very little. So, it doesn't assume the structure of the game. Well, many algorithms do assume information about the game, such as the structure, the other players' action arsenal, the relationship between your own actions and your payoffs, and whether other players' actions can be observed, and whether other players' payoffs can be read off from the opposite payoff matrices or in real time. And a very bold assumption is that players are aware that they are in a game, and a yet stronger assumption is that players are intelligent, and an even stronger assumption is that they are hyper intelligent and know of each other that they are hyper intelligent. And the last assumption is the assumption of common knowledge of rationality, CKA, capital CKA. That's an important assumption in game theory in general, that players are intelligent, hyper intelligent, and know of each other that they are hyper intelligent, and know of each other that they know of each other that they are hyper intelligent, and so on. So these are quite some assumptions in game playing, and some algorithms need some of these assumptions, and other algorithms need even more of these assumptions. Now, sometimes an algorithm can assume very little. Maybe it doesn't have access to the structure of the game. An algorithm doesn't know who's playing. An algorithm doesn't know what the other players have actions available. Or an algorithm can't observe the actions of other players. And most certainly this assumption holds, that players obviously can't look into each other's minds and can't observe how much they would like the outcome of a game. Maybe an algorithm isn't even aware that it's in a game. So, this presentation is partly based on a paper of Stimson, which is referred to on the site and at the end of the slides. And he makes the acute observation that this takes a problem out of game theory into machine learning, and it becomes just a matter of type of reinforcement learning. If we resort to reinforcement learning, then we don't monitor, for example, the average payoffs, and monitoring the average payoffs of our actions may accommodate useful information. Also, a disadvantage of resorting to reinforcement learning is that we have seen that theory formation about reinforcement learning is difficult. So a slightly more sophisticated algorithm that resembles reinforcement learning but uses a tad more information is satisficing play. And satisficing play is based on the principle of being satisfied with a certain outcome rather than striving for maximizing outcome. And the famous economist Herbert Simon is famous for his research on satisficing behavior of human beings, because human beings are not hyper intelligent but have bounded rationality. So his quote is, or a famous quote is, a decision maker who chooses the best available alternative according to some criteria is said to optimize. So this is about the best available alternative, the best. So optimizing. One who chooses an alternative that meets or exceeds specified criteria, but it is not guaranteed to be either unique or in any sense the best, is said to satisfy. So good is good enough. And human beings or algorithms usually don't have the resources to compute the optimal solution, which often is not needed anyway. Other quote by Simpson: decision makers can satisfy either by finding optimum solutions for a simplified world, or by finding satisfactory solutions for a more realistic world. Of course, in simple worlds is accordingly simple to find optimal solutions, but if we have to make decisions in a realistic world, it's not very realistic to wait for the optimum solution. We should go by satisfactory solutions. So neither approach in general dominates the other, and both have continued to coexist in the world of management science, says Herbert Simon. Just to, I think, picked out some characteristic quotes in this context of maximizing versus satisficing, or optimizing versus satisficing. Next slide. So here's the original algorithm for satisficing play. It's first published and proposed and published by Karandikar. So at any time, the agent state is a tuple action. So in the prisoner dilemma, that could be cooperate or defect, and alpha. And that is the level of satisfaction, or the level of aspiration. So the idea is that the agent wants to have its payoff at least alpha. If not, the agent chooses another action. That's the idea. And if alpha is met during subsequent play, then the agent won't change its action. That's the idea. Now the alpha is updated by the actual payoff in any round. So the aspiration is updated slightly, for example by 10%. Lambda is called the persistent rate. So if lambda is high, the persistent of aspiration is high, and the aspiration will change very slowly. So if the persistence rate lambda is near to 1, the aspiration level will change very slowly as an effect of payoffs in every round. So lambda is the persistent rate and pi sub t is the payoff in round t. Now we have to choose an initial action for the agent and an initial aspiration level. And it is wise to set the initial aspiration unrealistically high so that, well, the satisfying algorithm will change its action very often in the first couple of rounds because it's never satisfied. So if we set the aspiration level, the initial aspiration level very high, then this condition is never met, or most likely will never be met in the first couple of rounds. And in the first couple of rounds, the agent will explore, because this is the exploration alternative. And this is, of course, the exploitation alternative, to exploit what's already known. So if satisfied, then keep exploiting, because the current payoff is as high as the aspiration level. And if not satisfied, then explore. Now, of course, any other action may be replaced by any action. By coincidence, you may choose the same action, but by and large, the effect of the algorithm is the same. So here's an example of satisficing play. We take as an example game the prisoner dilemma. The strategy of the first player is tit for tat, and the strategy of the second player is satisficing play, with initial state chosen by us. And we choose as an initial action C and an initial aspiration level of 5. So in practice we have better chosen a bit higher aspiration level, so as to ensure that the algorithm explores in the first couple of rounds. Let's see how this works out. Never mind the graph on the right, it displays prematurely. We will discuss it in a moment. So, well, at the outset, tit for tat a player starts with cooperating due to tit for tat, and the satisficing player starts with cooperating due to our choice here. And the payoff in the 0th round is 3. The aspiration level was set to 5, and well, the persistence rate is 5, so that means that the new aspiration level is 3 plus 5 divided by 2, so it's just the average of 3 and 5 is 4. So because the payoff in the 0th round is lower than the aspiration level, the second player will change its action. So the first player plays tit for tat and echoes the second player, so the first player echoes the second player because of tit for tat, and the second player changes action, so I make this bold faced to indicate that the second player changes action. Well, the payoff for the second player is 5. We aren't interested in the payoff of the first player. And we already observed that the new aspiration level is the average of the old aspiration level and the old payoff in the payoff in the previous round. So that's 4. 3 and 5 is 4. Okay. Now this time the payoff for the second player is higher than its aspiration level, so it will execute the same action in the next round. don't mind the tit for tat. Tit for tat is doing its own thing, but we're interested in the behavior of the satisfying player. So it would stick to its action because 5 is greater than 4. The payoff in the previous round is as large as its aspiration. So this time the payoff of the second player is 1 because both defect, and the new aspiration value is the average of the payoff in the previous round and the old aspiration value. Well, we do one more round. So as the payoff is lower than the current aspiration value, the second player will change his action. The first player plays tit for tat. The second player changes his action, so I make this bold-faced. And now the payoff is even worse for the second player. Aspiration level is updated. It's the average of 1 and 4.5. And so on. So that's how satisficing play proceeds. And you see that during the play the aspirations lower. So the second player, who is a satisficing player, initially has high aspirations of what is achievable in this game, but while playing the game the second player will adapt his aspirations to reality, to what is really achievable in this game. Like so. Okay. So I have a nice demo for you, I should say, in store of satisficing play in a 2-player game where each player has 3 actions. So we have 2 players in a 3x3 game in normal form. So a 3x3 game has 9 payoff profiles because 3x3 actions. And these 9 payoff profiles are plotted here. So this is the payoff profile. Well, this is 00 and this is 10-10 here. This is 10-10. So this will be probably something like 3 for the first player and 2 for the second player. And this will be something like 6 for the, or 7 for the first player and 1 for the second player. And this payoff profile, which is by the way Pareto optimal, as you can see, as is this one, is also this one is Pareto optimal. This one not, because it's dominated by this one. This one is, for example, 5, payoff of 5 or 6 for the for the first player and 8 for the second player. 8 for the second player. So you plot all those 9 pure payoff profiles into dimensions and you initialize 100 satisficing player profiles. So 100 satisficing player pairs, in which this is the first player and this is the second player. And the pairs are depicted by circles. So this is one pair. And the coordinates of this pair are the aspirations. So the alpha t and the beta t. The alpha t and the beta t. So you have 100 of those profiles, of those player profiles. So I already indicated that the coordinates of one choose profile are the alpha and the beta. And now you execute satisficing play for all players, or for all player profiles simultaneously. So let's do this with a random game. Well, there are many possible random games. Let's take a nice one. Yeah, this was a nice one. So here are the payoffs. So this is the payoff if both players choose A, and the payoff for the first player and the payoff for the second player. This is if the first player chooses A and the second player chooses B. Then this is the payoff for the first player and this is the payoff for the second player, and so on. Here all players have set their aspirations high, so the alpha and the beta are in this case 10 here. So this coordinate is 10, 10, and this coordinate is 0, 0. So the initial aspirations are high. So let's take a few steps. So while they're playing, all player profiles, or all players in player profiles, discover that their actual payoffs are lower than, here are the actual payoffs are lower than their aspiration levels. So they change actions, and accordingly the aspirations decrease until the actual outcomes, for example here, the actual outcomes are higher than the aspirations, and then they won't change their action anymore. Either one of the couples, either one of every couple. So here, let's see. Here, the first player well, we can't tell the actions of either players. So if at least one player is not satisfied, actions will change. But at some point both players are satisfied, and then both players stick to their action, and the profiles will converge to here. So here, for example, these player profiles stick to this action profile, or stick to this payoff profile here that's associated with an action profile. So this payoff profile is, for example, well, this is what? This is 8, 6 or so, 8, 6. And you can find it here somewhere, it's not important, but it should be represented by an action profile. Of course, every payoff profile should be represented by an action profile. So these player profiles here have chosen to stick to this payoff profile, which corresponds to an action profile. And these player profiles here have chosen to stick to this Pareto optimal, apparently Pareto optimal payoff profile. Okay, and if you repeat that then eventually player profiles converge. And you can play, of course, with, for example, with the persistent rate. If you choose a higher persistent rate, closer to 1, let's see what happens. Well, the movement is slower, but it has also effect on, well, this takes some time. So the movement is slower, and the profiles have a tendency to shoot past the payoff profiles and be more accurate about to which profile they converge to. Well, this is a good choice for both of them because, well, this is of course Pareto optimal and certainly optimal for the second player. Let's lower the persistent rate gradually. So now we'll lower the persistent rate. And you see that now also other Pareto optimal profiles are reached. Okay. Well, you can play with this app yourself and turn on some knobs and whistles, bells and whistles, and experiment for yourself. So we now discuss further article of Stimson. You may leave the explanation now here. You know enough for your programming assignment, and I continue now for the sake of completeness of the presentation so that I can use it in possibly subsequent years. So Stimson and associates experiment with satisficing play on a generalized form of the prisoner dilemma. So this is the sigma is the reward for mutual cooperation, and delta is the reward for mutual defection. Which is in the literature is called reward here. And this is called the temptation payoff. This is called the succor payoff. And delta is called the punishment payoff. We have to abide by these constraints, otherwise it's no longer a prisoner dilemma, because well, players can agree to, for example, to alternate between those two and still achieve a higher payoff than by defecting. So we have to apply these constraints. We use standard satisficing play, and with initial states A, capital A, alpha, and capital B, beta. So if both players avail themselves of satisficing play, we can have a couple of outcomes. Stability, when there's convergence to a certain action profile. This happens if both players are satisfied. So if the actual outcomes in every round are as high as the aspiration levels. We can have periodicity, that is convergence to a cycle of action profiles, like for example here. This is one cycle, which then may repeat. A cycle of period 3 is this is. Or we may end in chaotic behavior. That is deterministic behavior, but which is non-periodic. So Stimson and associates experimented with this setup by letting sigma vary through these values, by letting the punishment vary through these values with the optimum sigma, of course, and letting initial aspirations vary by these values here, initial actions random 50-50, and varying the persistence rate between 0.1 and 0.9. Then most of the time the players converge to mutual cooperation, and 3/4 of the time the players converge to a cycle of period 4 in which they both defected, then the second player cooperated and the first player defected, and so on. You see? And in a marginal number of outcomes, there was a cycle of 3 of this form, and well, lower than 1%, not 0%, but lower than 1%, or about 1% of mutual defections. Then Stimson and associates varied the initial aspirations and left the other parameters constant. So on the x-axis there are the initial aspirations of the first player, and on the y-axis are the initial aspirations of the second player. And you see if both start with high initial aspirations, then the probability of ending in mutual cooperation is high. We speak of a probability because each experiment is started with other parameters that are chosen at random, and also the satisficing algorithm has a random component, because if you're not satisfied you choose for another action. Well, if you have 2 actions, that's just 1 action, but still. So there's a random component involved. So satisficing play becomes random as if you have more than 2 alternative actions, because then you have a choice between 2 alternative actions, but that's not the case in the prisoner dilemma. So starting with high aspirations is good. And this is the same plot simulated with Netlogo, just to check, to reproduce this experiment of Stimson and to check the outcome. So the light colors indicate that most of the trials the agent learned to cooperate, because each pixel here represent multiple experiments, because for each pair of initial aspirations we have a multitude of other parameter settings. Of course we can't run down all, we cannot exhaustively run down all alternative parameter settings, because for example the persistence rate may vary between 0.1 and 0.9, and that's a continuum, so you can execute as many experiments as you want here. But the picture becomes clearer and clearer. This is becoming white and this is becoming more black. So as a final, no, not as a final, but as a alternative scenario, Stimson and associates varied with the reward and punishment parameters, sigma and delta. Sigma for reward and delta for punishment. And they discovered that for low delta, so if the punishment is high, then there's an incentive for cooperation. And it is more dependent on delta than of sigma. Higher sigma stimulates cooperation, but not as much as delta. If you go to look into their article, then what's their explanation here? Well, they call this varying on the structure of the payoff matrix. And they observe that the structure of the payoff matrix has considerable influence on the ability to cooperate. Yeah, we see that. For low delta, there's a high probability of cooperation. And what's their explanation? Note that cooperation is most likely when, well, we have observed this as well. And their explanation is this is expected because the distinction between cooperation and defection blurs when delta and sigma are close. Yes, well, this is almost like an open door, I would say. So, okay. Then Stimson and Goodrich varied with the effects of initial actions. So if the initial actions were to cooperate at the outset, then eventually there was 80% of cooperation. But curiously enough, if both parties choose to defect at the outset, there is still the same amount of cooperation in probability at the end. However, if both parties start as follows, the first party starts to cooperate and the other party starts to defect, or conversely, then the probability of cooperation in the end is lower. So that's remarkable. And then finally, the authors experimented with varying the persistence rate. And of course, if the persistence rate is high, then agents stick to are less amenable to change their aspiration rate. So they're much more stable, and this results in a higher level of cooperation. Well, if we're going to check this in the app, so we choose for the prisoner dilemma. That means we have a 2x2 matrix that is akin to the prisoner dilemma here, and all other payoffs are 0. So here are the payoffs of the prisoner dilemma. Here I choose for 2.5 because that is in one line with this one here, with the payoff for mutual cooperation. This is the payoff for mutual defection here. Here the payoff is 0 for all other actions, and here is the payoff if the first player cooperates and the second player defects, and conversely here. So we first perform this experiment with a high persistence rate. And you see that all player profiles shoot with double O. The Pareto optimal payoff profile and converge to the Pareto optimal profile. And if the persistence rate is lower, then we have this. Of course. So there's a larger tendency to converge to suboptimal payoff profiles. If the persistence rate is 1, of course, never happens. If the persistence rate is 1, there is no adaptation. So I would say that the graph would continue to increase here and suddenly drops discontinuously to O here. Because that's the explanation that the authors give, that cooperation increases continuously and gradually and not monotonically, but gradually. Monotonically if the number of trials is increased, then the variation and the randomness will even out, and it will increase monotonically. And it drops suddenly, discontinuously at 1 because there is no adaptation. then to experiment with specific parameters. So if you vary on all parameters but fix the initial aspirations, for example here the initial aspirations are low, and if the initial aspirations are low, then on the average there is no cooperation, which is black. And if the initial aspirations are high, 2, then there will be a guaranteed mutual cooperation, which is white. However, if the initial aspirations of the second player is too low and of the third player of the first player is high here, then there will be no mutual cooperation in the end. So the initial aspiration of the first player is on the x-axis here, and the initial aspiration of the second player is on the y-axis. White represents convergence to mutual cooperation. Black represents not only convergence to something different than mutual cooperation, but in fact convergence to mutual defection. And gray is represents periodic or chaotic behavior. The reward and the punishment payoffs and the persistence rate are kept constant. And the initial actions for both players are defect. So both players start to defect. And then we will obtain this graph, which is quite interesting because here it matters very much with which aspiration level both players start. So we can reproduce this. So the first scenario, we have 3 scenarios. The first scenario is where both players defect. One is defect and O, so one is defect and O is cooperate. So both players defect. The reward for cooperating is 0.8. The reward for both defecting is 0.7. And the persistence rate is 0.9. On the right, we have the spot of the initial aspiration levels, which is 1, 1, and the radius is the level x and y. So the dimensions of this square are 0, 0, 2, 0, 2, 2, because the radius is 1. So this is 1, 1, plus 1 is 2, 2, 2. Here's 0.2. And so the movement or the animation is caused by the convergence to either cooperation in the end or defection. So for these aspiration levels, it is very clear that both players will converge to mutual cooperation. But here it's less clear. The red indicates that there is tendency to converge to mutual defection, and the green indicates that there is tendency to mutual cooperation. So we can increase the resolution, for example. We can increase it even more. So it doesn't matter much. So if we change the resolution, the areas remain the same. You see? Oh, like so. So this is the highest possible resolution. I will pause the video for a moment, and so here we're back after a couple of seconds. We'll pause the video again. You are back after about 30 seconds, and you see that the higher resolution doesn't necessarily mean that the areas of cooperation or defection are more fine-grained. So, okay. So, yeah, we've just seen that. And according to different scenarios, we have different outcomes. So, if we change the scenario of, now let's say that both players start to cooperate, and the reward and punishment level are thus, and the persistence rate is lower, we get another interesting outcome. Well, I can't think I better discuss this with the demo. So this is the first, the outcome of the first scenario. We've already discussed this. This is the outcome of the second scenario. So both players start out to cooperate, which is action O. Cooperate is action O. And the reward and punishment payoffs are 0.8 and 0.5, and the persistence rate is lower. Then eventually this, so if players have high initial aspirations, there is cooperation, but if in this area player 1 has high initial aspirations and player 2 has a bit lower initial aspiration, then in the end there is no mutual cooperation. This is not entirely black, so this is not entirely mutual defection. It's somewhere in between. So circulation or periodic behavior. And a third interesting scenario is this one. So the first player starts to defect and the second player starts to cooperate. Here are the reward and punishment levels and the persistence rate. Then you see that for some levels here, for some starting levels of aspiration, the first player continues to cooperate and the second player continues to defect. And for other levels there is cyclic behavior in some way. You see the colors are slightly different here. This is more red, so this means that the second player cooperates more often eventually than the first player, and here it's the other way around. And yellow means that there is mutual cooperation in the end, and black means that there is mutual defection in the end. So we are able to reproduce this figure here of Stimson and Guthrie. Reproduction is very important in science, and it's very rarely done, but because you can't, it doesn't yield you much. But it's very important in science to be able to reproduce results. So what are the difficult games for satisficing play? Well, rock, paper, scissors, for example. You see, because, well, you have 9 payoff profiles, but each payoff profile is multiplied 3 times. You see here in the payoff matrix, for example, 5, 5 is multiplied 3 times on the main diagonal. And you see that satisfying play has difficulties because it is never satisfied, so to speak. And because of the circular nature of rock, paper, scissors. So another example of a difficult game is the Shapley game, with positive payoffs that look as follows. So on the main diagonal there is no particular reward, but then the rewards circulate off diagonal. So this is just a Shapley matrix, but then with positive numbers. And why did I choose 2 and 7? Because the payoff profiles are nicely depicted in the O by 10 square. That's why. So there's nothing special about 2 and 7, as long as they're satisfying the proportions of the Shapley matrix. Then you see that satisficing play has difficulties. You see, they don't know to which profile to converge to, because they're never satisfied. They keep changing between the profiles, but because they keep changing, they aren't able to converge. And the nastiest example that I could think of for satisficing play is the following one, where the payoff profiles, the 9 payoff profiles are different. So these are all 9 payoff profiles, they're all different, and they lie in a curve, some sort of hyperbolic curve. And then satisficing play is teased to the maximum, as you see. Now there I really can't choose. Peyton Young, in his monograph Strategic Learning and Its Limits, proposed regret matching as a form of satisficing play in the following way. If you define an aspiration level as the average of all payoffs, and then, so that's a realistic aspiration level, you should at least score better than the average of all payoffs. Then you define for every action the reinforcement level as the difference between the payoff in that round for your action as opposed to the action of the opponent, minus the aspiration level, and then the propensities of play in the next round as the positive parts of the accumulated reinforcement increments. So you see here that you add all reinforcement increments for every action up until including the current route, and you choose that action proportionally with respect to the accumulated reinforcement increments. So this is like standard reinforcement, but now all actions in a given period are reinforced or negatively reinforced, whether or not they're actually played. So this is a kind of hypothetical reinforcement learning that takes into account virtual payoffs. So payoffs that you never experienced. So this is discussed in Peyton-Young's Chapter 2, Strategic Learning and its Limits. Chapter 2 is on reinforcement learning and no-regret learning. Okay, next slide. So this is not the satisficing play of Karandikar. This is a different form of satisficing play. And I think it will take some effort to prove that is indeed identical to no regret, because Peyton-Young claims that this is regret matching in the end. Next slide. So if you implement this, then it's wise to start out with high enough initial aspirations, and that agents should learn but slowly, so keep the persistence rate high. For the prisoner dilemma scenario, the difference between payoffs of mutual defection and mutual cooperation should be maximized in order to profile the payoffs, otherwise there is no dynamics. It is for the prisoner dilemma scenario, we have seen that it is beneficial for agents if they start out with similar behavior, but I think this conclusion cannot be generalized to beyond the prisoner dilemma. And the authors finally set up a grand experiment within the following confined parameter space, which accommodates the most common parameters, so persistence rate near to 1, the payoff for punishment is not too close to the payoff for reward, and so on. So these are more realistic. This is a more realistic portion of the parameter space. And the participants start out with initial actions, like is advised. Here, agents should start out with similar behavior. So these two should be the same. And then in this confined part of the parameter space, there is 100% mutual cooperation eventually. So satisficing plays will prove, as we shall see in the next lecture, to be a simple but very efficient algorithm in terms of having payoffs. So Bayesian play we already discussed, and the gradient dynamics we already discussed. So that's not next, but that's beyond us. So what's left is a discussion of the Boole algorithm and a discussion of related work. Hope to see you on the other side. Thanks for bearing with me.